Crises and emergencies are the time-honored way by which people lose their rights and liberties. Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we examine this phenomenon in the context of the coronavirus crisis. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as many of you know, brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. And I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners at a trying and difficult time, but no less an important time to remind ourselves of some of the aspects and elements of freedom that are being infringed upon or threatened, even at a moment of crisis, and they should not be forgotten.
Yeah, it's auspicious circumstances indeed. I mean, I think that we're facing a period in our lives that could possibly be the greatest threat to our health and our liberty, because we can see what government's doing in response to its failure and the failure of its system to deal with this crisis. And so if you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, you can come to our website at fff.org. We've been addressing issues like this, not directly like with the coronavirus, of course, but indirectly. I mean, Richard, as you'll recall, when we first started the Future of Freedom Foundation in 1989, we came out with the very first issue of our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which at that time was called Freedom Daily. And we were addressing issues like health care. I mean, our very first book was called The Dangers of Socialized Medicine. This was 30 years ago, where we talked about the importance of having a free market healthcare system. And of course, people said you're too extreme, you're too radical. We have to have government involvement in healthcare. If government's not involved in healthcare, everybody will be dying in the streets and all this. And we kept continuously saying that this is the root of the problem with healthcare crises in America. Government involvement, whether it's central planning, central control, central regulation that we're experiencing today, or these two massive socialist programs, Medicare and Medicaid, and creating this mindset of dependency on people that they can't survive with this thing, that the crises were just getting bigger and bigger over the last 30 years. And we should never forget that before this corona crisis, we were in the midst of a giant healthcare crisis. That was the whole purpose of Obamacare, to fix the healthcare crisis. And it was all because of government involvement in this thing. And then the corona crisis hits, and man, I mean, it's total dysfunctionality. You've got these government officials running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And it's, Ludwig von Mises had the perfect term. One of his books is entitled Planned Chaos. I mean, what better term to describe what's going on here now? I mean, you really do have planned chaos here. It's chaos resulting from central planning. And you have the shortages of the masks and the shortages of the testing kits and the shortages of the ventilators. This is classic type of Soviet Union type central planning consequences. This would never happen in a free market. If we were being led by the healthcare industry, which is what would be happening with a free market, the politicians wouldn't be playing any role in this. This is a health crisis. And we would be looking to the healthcare industry for guidance. What do you need to do? There would be plenty of testing kits. There wouldn't be shortages. They probably would be delivered to your house. They would cost $2 each, where everybody would be tested. And then you start isolating the people that are testing positive, but everybody else continues to work and live their lives, because this cure that they're doing could actually be worse than the disease. And I think another thing that we ought to talk about in this show is how they react, these government officials, to the failure of their system, to the breakdown of their system. Because this also is characteristic of the Soviet Union and totalitarian regimes, or socialist regimes that rely on central planning and socialism. Is that as the system fails, they inevitably start resorting to tyranny. orders, mandates, curfews, shutdowns, lockdowns. I mean, isn't that how the communist regime in China has reacted? And here, what's fascinating is that U.S. officials are doing the exact same thing that the communist regime in China is doing in response to this same central planning failure and breakdown. And what's fascinating also is that you see the dictatorial aspect of people that hold public office coming out. I mean, governors here in Virginia, the governor has issued an executive order. I mean, like a decree. I mean, when Augusto Pinochet was put into office by the U.S. national security establishment, he had what were called decree laws because there was no legislature. And so whatever he decreed was the law because he was the dictator. And so you see this phenomenon taking place now where governors or mayors are issuing their decree laws and creating punishments for people who violate them without going to the legislative branch of the government and say, you know, I'd like to do this. May I have permission? And then you have gun stores being closed because they're not essential. You know, gun sales are soaring in this crisis. Why? Well, I guess you'd have to ask each person. But my hunch is that people are sensing there could be disorder if all of a sudden there's shortages of food or things start to break down in society in a major way. They want the ability to protect their families, themselves, and so gun sales are soaring. So what do the little mini tyrants do? They say this is not essential, and they're trying to shut down the gun rights and the ability of people to buy guns. And then you've got the Justice Department going to Congress and asking for permission to suspend due process of law. I mean, this is the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. And here they are saying, we want to suspend this so we can indefinitely detain people if necessary. I mean, so this is what inevitably happens, Richard, when you got a breakdown of a corrupt, crooked, dysfunctional economic system. It ultimately manifests itself in tyranny and oppression. What do you think?
Well, I think that an important point that we all should keep in mind and not forget is that the importance of constitutions and procedures of rule of law is to protect us during moments of crisis. During normal times, people go about their lives, everybody's sort of law-abiding, they expect the agents of the government, the officials of the government, to abide by the rules. You don't do a search without a warrant. You're expected, as you were saying, with writ of habeas corpus, not to be held indefinitely. You have to be brought before a judge in a timely manner and demonstrate that there's reason to believe that you are a legitimate suspect once it is determined that a crime has occurred, et cetera, et cetera. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of association. But when a crisis occurs, when there is concern about the social or the economic or the health stability of the society, people immediately fall into an emotional reaction, an hysterical reaction, some people. Something has got to be done. Who's going to do it? Why haven't they done it yet? Yet it is those very moments that we must take a deep breath and attempt to remain dispassionate as best we can, and recall that and keep in mind that unless we maintain the principles and ideals and the practice of the civil liberties, the personal freedom, the economic freedom that is in the Constitution and in the original traditions and customs of this country, it is very easy to lose them, to see them abridged. And then once they have been abridged or been lost, once this crisis passes, and it will, how many lives would be tragically affected, coming down with the illness or dying? We see those projections, but who really knows? But once this crisis does pass, we will be left with these institutional changes in which government has extended its reach, its intrusiveness, its control over many aspects of our lives. And once they're in place, it is always difficult to reverse them. You mentioned healthcare. One perfect example of this. When Obamacare was being proposed during the Obama administration, many libertarians and conservatives too were concerned about it being passed as a law, because once it's institutionally in place and it's been there for a while, it is very difficult to dismantle because of the network of special interest groups who now become dependent or see gains from its presence in the system. And have we been able to totally reverse Obamacare? Forget about a totally free market health, even the Obamacare part. No. It's practically viewed as unchangeable as we normally have thought of Social Security. Right, the third rail, you can't touch it. Well, once these controls and regulations and oversight and restrictions on freedom come into place in the name of the emergency of the moment, it will be very difficult to reverse all of them, because it'll be there, that you will see growth in bureaucracies, in allocations of money, and people will have vested interests, as well as others or the same people with ideological motives to want to have these controls, to do all in their power to see that they are not completely reversed. Maybe some of our viewers and listeners are familiar with an excellent classical liberal libertarian historian named Robert Higgs, who a good number of years ago wrote a book called Crisis and Leviathan, in which he hammered away that if you look at crises that have occurred in U.S. history, especially though not exclusively wars, when government has extended its powers to meet the crisis, and then the crisis has passed, the government pulls back in some ways. Some taxes are reduced, some spending is limited, some controls are lifted, but you don't go back to what had existed before. So it's a ratchet effect. Each crisis results in a growth of government, and it never returns to what it was before the crisis. And I fear that unless we are firmly aware and outspoken and appreciative of the importance of protecting these liberties, we will see a major ratcheting up of the growth of government, which will not be returned to the status quo ante when the crisis is passed.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up this point about the Constitution, because sometimes it's important when these kind of things happen and you see this massive catastrophe taking place, is to return to first principles and see how the deviation or the abandonment or the rejection of those first principles playing a role in what's going on here now. That when the Constitution called the federal government into existence, it wasn't a sure thing that the American people were going to accept it. I mean, they had been operating under the Articles of Confederation for more than 10 years. And that was a different type of governmental system. It was one where the federal government's powers were so weak, get this, the federal government didn't even have the power to tax, because they just didn't trust the federal government. Our American ancestors, they had just seceded from the most powerful government in history, one with the most powerful military in the world, the British Empire, and they said, we don't want to have anything to do with that kind of system anymore. So when the delegates met at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, it was simply to reform the Articles of Confederation. There had been problems arising with the Articles, trade wars between the states and so forth. So they were charged with the task of just fixing the Articles. Instead, they meet in secret. They come back with an entirely new proposal. And they said, we want to call into existence a new federal government here, including a government that has the power to tax, but not levy income taxes, just indirect taxes, which are less intrusive, they said. Well, Americans were really leery of this thing. I mean, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they were going to accept it, because they said, this is a government that's going to be ending up taking away our liberties. And the answer to that was no, because the Constitution, which is the document that will call it into existence, will limit it to certain powers. And so if the power is not enumerated in there, it doesn't exist. Now, we hear a lot in this crisis about the police powers of the states, the inherent police powers. And what people are referring to is the old European concept that government has inherent powers by its own nature. And this goes back to the omnipotent regimes of the king back in England, that the king can do anything because he's protecting the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the people. And these were called the traditional police powers of government. It's these powers that our ancestors were very concerned with. That if you give government these powers, these inherent police powers that had characterized European governments throughout history, there was the recipe for tyranny. And so the answer to this was no. This is going to be a federal government that doesn't have inherent police powers. Its powers are going to be limited to the Constitution, to right here. People said, okay, we'll go along with it on that basis. Now, if you had told the American people that they were going to be bringing into existence a government that has the authority to do shutdowns, lockdowns, curfews, travel controls, restrictions in an emergency, they would have laughed. And a national security state to enforce it all, vast military, CIA, NSA, FBI, they would have laughed. They would have thought it was a joke. And they would have said, never mind, when they realized it was serious, we'll stick with the Articles of Confederation. There's no chance that they would have approved the type of government we live under today. And to make sure people got the message, they enacted the Bill of Rights, which really should have been called the Bill of Prohibitions, because it doesn't give people rights. It stops the government from interfering with the exercise of pre-existing rights, because they said our rights come from nature, and nature's God, as Jefferson said in the Declaration. So, but notice the wording, that Congress will not destroy our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, will not take away our right to keep and bear arms, will not lock us up without due process of law. The mindset was, if we don't say these things, this government's going to do these things. That was their mindset. And notice, which gets to the point you were making, there was no emergency exception in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Now, it doesn't say Congress shall not destroy freedom of speech except in an emergency or a crisis, or destroy the right to keep and bear arms except in a crisis. Liberty, property, life without due process of law except in emergency. And why? Because, as you point out, they understood that's when these rights are at greatest risk of being destroyed. During normal times, it's hard to get people to give up their liberties voluntarily. But in a crisis, people get afraid and they say, okay. And so they make a bargain with the devil. We'll trade away our liberties temporarily, but as soon as the crisis is over, then give them back to us. And as you point out, and as Robert Higgs points out, you never get them all back. You have this ratcheting effect. And so our ancestors understood that crises and emergencies are the time-honored way by which people lose their rights and liberties. And we can see that happening now, which makes it more imperative than ever, Richard, that we libertarians continue emphasizing, especially during a crisis or emergency, why we can't fall for this siren song of trading liberty for the pretense of security. Because you don't end up with security anyway. I mean, that's what history has shown, that you fall for the siren song of, oh, give us your liberty and we'll keep you safe and secure. And at the end of it, they have lost all liberty and they've lost all safety and security, because now they're living under a tyrannical regime.
Well, one way of appreciating the point that you're making and I tried to make, in terms of Madison's record of the Constitutional Convention, when the delegates from the various states came to discuss what powers should the president have in making war, there were those who said, well, we're an imminent threat, an invasion fleet is off the coast, so some country has offended the dignity of our country. A president should have the authority to initiate war, declare a war. And the delegates were very clear in this, if you read Madison's account, that the purpose was not to make war easier for the president, but to clog the way of doing so. That the Congress would have to declare war. They would have to allocate the funds. In other words, to do everything possible not to drag America into undesirable directions due a time of crisis or hysteria. Now, that's just meant to be an example. People have referred to this battle, that's a military term in itself, with this virus as a war. It's threatening the health and the safety of literally tens of millions of people, from what all the medical experts say. And what is the immediate response? Well, the government has to treat this like a war and do what's necessary. Well, that's exactly when we should be most concerned and hesitant about giving the latitude and authority to the government to act in these arbitrary ways outside of the properly and narrowly defined and expressed duties and responsibilities of the federal government, and what remains is the untouchable liberties of the people.
Yeah, because this is the time when things are most at risk. And you know, you talked a little bit about this declaration of war type thing, or you alluded to it. And I find it so fascinating that you've got this juxtaposition taking place where the government is over here, you know, with a total breakdown of the healthcare system, the centrally planned healthcare system. They're resorting to tyranny. People are dying, while at the same time the government is involved in these military wars, undeclared wars, killing people. I mean, it's like this weird, surreal world where you got death here and death over there, and the federal government is at the root of this both massive deaths that are taking place. And as you pointed out, when it came to war in the Constitution, our ancestors were real clear. They didn't trust presidents with war because they get offended, they get into personal battles with other dictators or other rulers. And so, man, they're more than willing to use a vast permanent military establishment to go teach those third world rulers a lesson. And so what the framers were doing was trying to clog that up, to make it difficult for the ruler to go to war, because they've seen this throughout history. That's why you had the declaration of war requirement, because they didn't trust the president when it came to war. And they said, if you want to go to war against one of your little enemies or opponents or whatever, you have to get a declaration of war from Congress. Well, you know, a lot of presidents, they didn't like that restriction. Like, hey, but how am I going to go fight against my opponent over there if I got to go ask Congress for permission? Well, that was the law. And the fact is that the Constitution is a law that we, the people, have imposed on our government officials. Well, as we can see, ever since World War II, now by and large, they complied with the restriction. The Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, but at that point, after World War II, you get this whole change in mentality, sort of like the Constitution has to be ignored. You bring into existence the national security state, where the CIA has the power to assassinate people. You know, where's the power to assassinate people in the Constitution? Or conduct mass secret surveillance, or invade countries because they're involved in a project that's communist oriented, and do a regime change operation. And at that point, people just went along with it. There was this fear. You had the fear of the big crisis of the Cold War. Oh, that the communists were coming to get us. And communism was kind of viewed like a virus, like the coronavirus. Oh my gosh, it's infecting the population, and the Reds are coming to get us. And so they go into Korea, which was really just a civil war, and they lose tens of thousands of American men there. You've got then the Vietnam War. You lose 58,000 men there, just another civil war. But it created this whole sense of the Constitution just isn't that important. That, okay, let them ignore that declaration of war requirement. We've got an emergency that's called the Cold War, and so what? Well, notice now this mindset is still going on even worse now. That once you go down that road of not requiring public officials to comply with your law, your restrictions, now the floodgates are open. I mean, they're essentially doing whatever they want to do. And now, what's the result of all this? The destruction of freedom. I mean, that's the end of this road. The destruction of freedom in America. Total destruction. Because people have gotten to this deference to authority mindset. They know what's best. The government knows what's best. The experts know what's best. Well, they don't know, because their system of central planning relies on what Friedrich Hayek called the fatal conceit of the planner. That the planner knows how to resolve all these problems. So when you've got an inherently defective system like that, that's the danger, that they're going to lash out and say the only way that we can keep you safe now is to put you in your little cages, lock the door, and don't worry, as soon as the crisis is over, we will let you out.
You see, exacerbating this is that we now have several generations of Americans who know very little, if anything, about the Constitution, about the Bill of Rights, about traditional notions of liberty, personal, social, and economic. When students or even adults are queried in surveys about the Bill of Rights, or what is secure as one of these rights and what is not, or what are the functions of government, what are the branches of government, what are the duties of the executive versus the Congress, etc., they are illiterate. They know nothing. And that's because, again, through government education now, dominated by the progressives who insist that, everything is changeable. We need a living constitution. There's no, unchanging or eternal or absolutely right views about the nature of man or the role of government or the desirability of the meaning of a good and free society. It's just silly putty that you just, remold into a new shape each day as the circumstance seems to suggest. And so most Americans don't even think of it in the context. Have our rights been violated? Because, well, what's the meaning of rights? When compulsory redistribution of wealth is considered a right as an entitlement, then you've lost all meanings of what a right is, as opposed to a charitable and free and voluntary giving to help your fellow man. So we are in a crisis of a virus, a health crisis. We are in an economic crisis because the government has been shutting the country down with these stay-at-home orders, except for what they define as essential industries and services. And we are now in a political philosophic crisis because a large number, if not a significant majority of Americans, have no notion of what is the meaning of a free society, the principles and ideas and the institutions upon which a free society is dependent, and therefore why they should be caring or concerned when blanketly government says, we have to do this, and their immediate response is, well, of course, because, well, what other benchmark would we use other than taking care of us in an emergency situation right now?
Yeah, this mindset that government is our daddy and therefore should be doing anything he can, like a parent would do with his child, to keep him safe is just pervading all through America. And so that's really an excellent point about that particular crisis. There's also, as you know, the monetary crisis, where the Fed is now just printing money like it was going out of style. I mean, the floodgates are open now for devaluation, debasement, and inflation, and we'll see the results of that down the line. And then in the background, I think it's worth mentioning that lurking in the background here is the national security state, the vast military, the CIA, the NSA, because, our ancestors had a reason for opposing the national security state. You can see there, they called it a standing army. And you can go to FFF's website and Google standing armies, and I've got a whole list of all the quotes there of what the founding fathers felt about standing armies or national security states, or what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. They said this is the greatest threat to freedom in a society, because when things get tyrannical, who do the rulers turn to enforce the tyranny? They turn to where the force is, the massive military establishment. We see this in communist countries. We see it in Latin American authoritarian countries. It's always the military that is going to enforce the orders. And so lurking in the background here are these people, the vast military establishment. And President Eisenhower warned about this. In his farewell address, he said, look, hey, we have this new type of governmental system here to fight this Cold War, but make no mistake about it. This is a grave threat to our liberties and democratic processes. Imagine, this is a guy that was Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in World War II. He knows the military. If anybody has been loyal to the military, it'd be Eisenhower. And here he is issuing this unbelievable, remarkable warning to the American people of watch out, because this is a grave threat to our processes, democratic processes, our liberties, our rights. And what he's referring to is that in a crisis, or one of the things he's referring to, is that the military is called upon to enforce order. And make no mistake about it. Okay, we often hear that the military takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution. That's nonsense. It's a charade. Their loyalty is to the president. They're going to obey whatever orders the president issues. And in their mind, that is equivalent to supporting and defending the Constitution. They're not going to sit there and determine whether the president's orders are constitutional or not. They're going to obey those orders. And this is why Eisenhower said this is a very, very dangerous apparatus. His implication was that it was necessary for the Cold War, which, of course, I question. But the Cold War ended, and notice that the apparatus that Eisenhower warned us about is still in play.
Yeah, there's one other thing that you mentioned, and that was this monetary aspect. You know, the Federal Reserve, wanting to adapt to the crisis, seems to be designing a plan where they would print trillions of dollars of paper money on a softer and smoother material so it can be used as toilet paper. And if this works, it may be one of the few things that government does that doesn't rub us the wrong way.
Well, you know, you've got a point, because you'll recall the hyperinflation in Germany where people had wheelbarrows full of paper money that was worthless. But, you know, I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it, Richard, that there's a positive side to this.
Exactly.
I think on that note, we probably should wrap things up.
Hey, listen, at a time like this, you have to have a little bit of a sense of humor. Otherwise, you go crazy.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I want to say that all y'all that are tuning in, I really hope that y'all are well and that your loved ones are well and that you're protecting yourself from this thing. And like Richard said, this thing will pass. But, you know, you've heard government officials using the importance of using crises to expand their powers and so forth. Well, these crises also provide an opportunity for us libertarians to emphasize the importance of liberty. I mean, people are paying attention now, Richard. I mean, nothing like the prospect of death to focus people's attention.
Oh, yes.
And this is, I think, one where we can seize on this opportunity to describe what the foundations of a genuinely free society are, so that we can build that foundation for the future. Because this isn't going to be the last pandemic. The epidemiologists say we're going to be hit by these things in the future. So, okay, the government's made a mess out of this with their corrupt, dysfunctional system, but we can build a foundation now for the future. And that's what we're doing here at the Future of Freedom Foundation.
So until next time.
Yep. See you next week. And thank you all for tuning in. Again, you can subscribe on our YouTube channel, and you can come over and visit us at fff.org, and we'll see you all next week. In the meantime, stay well, and we will continue fighting for the free society in the meantime.